All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another TLDR Vue.JS. If you can't tell by the title or the V coming out of my head, my name is Dylan Israel. I will be your host for this evening. So we're going to be diving into Vue. Now, the first thing you're going to be asking yourself, what is Vue? Vue is, I would call it a framework. Other people would call it a Vue library. But really, at the end of the day, it is a resource that you use in the front end to handle DOM manipulation, as well to add some to make single page applications really at the end of the day. So we're going to have things like routing. We're going to have good control flow in the template. It's going to be very similar to Angular 1 from the introduction standpoint, because Angular 1 heavily influenced it. It's going to give us some easier ways to do HTTP calls, AJAX calls. It's going to give us a lot of functionality. How will we learn Vue? So typically my tutorials will go and we'll just go over a bunch of stuff. And in this one, we are going to go over a bunch of stuff. I'm going to tell you what that is. But I decided to take a different path with this. I wanted to actually build a project from start to finish. So on here, we're building a very simple project because I think it will click more and we can show actual use cases how you might use some of this stuff. And in this instance, we're making a simple random quote generator, and I'll show you that right now. I want to thank our sponsor for the video, Dev Mountain Coding Bootcamp. If you guys are interested in learning iOS, QA, full stack web, UI, UX, Salesforce, they have a bunch of after hours, full-time, online courses. You can check them out at devmountain.com. On a side note, look forward to a couple weeks from now. I'll be on the Dev Mountain podcast talking about some stuff. I guess that's what you do on podcasts, right? So check them out, devmountain.com. You'll see we have this quote generator. If we were to refresh this, we have it gets us a new quote. We have a way to tweet it, as well as a way to do other stuff. We're getting the author. We'll have this new quote. It'll get us a new author and also put out the last author. I'm kind of zoomed in quite a bit. I didn't worry too much about responsive design on this. But you guys get the idea. This is hitting a asynchronous call. We're actually using routing in this as well. We have nested components, some ng if else statements going on here, some event listeners, event actions. We're going to be covering a whole bunch of stuff. Let's talk about what that is. All right, so I already kind of mentioned some of this stuff, but what are we going to be covering in this tutorial? Really everything you need to get up and going in Vue today by the end of this video. So we're going to get you started. I always like including that because that's probably one of the hardest parts. So not hardest parts, but a good place to start, I guess. And frustrating at times. So we're going to be talking about the Vue CLI, the command line interface that Vue has, and how you can just use that to get a project set up and going and run it locally and do all the changes you need so that you can get up and go and just start running with it. We're going to be talking about how to build components, how to work with nested components. We're going to be talking about data properties. We're going to be talking about props, how to pass props in, how to use props. We're going to talk about how we can assign methods to our components. We're going to be talking about some structural type directives like vif, velse, and von. We're also going to be showcasing string interpolation, how we can take perhaps the data properties and put it into the HTML as strings. We're also going to be talking about dynamic attribute / property bindings. How can we assign a class dynamically? Things like that. We're going to be showcasing the Vue router, which is going to handle different views. It's kind of VIEW views, different items shown in the router in the Vue slot in the router slot. So if you're not familiar with Vue routers, essentially you have one component swapping in and out while your route changes, but the rest of the app doesn't load. This is crucial for pretty much any single page application. We're also going to be talking about Vue resource, just a very brief introduction to how to use their HTTP package that they've built as well. And then we're going to talk a little bit about something that's a little bit more of a preference than anything else. We're going to showcase how to separate out your HTML, CSS, and Vue files. To me, I come from everything should be separated because I think they're different concerns. But I will say that the standard approach is to have it all in one file, and you could do that. But I'm going to show you how to separate it out all the same. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Alright, before we get started here, if you don't already have Node installed, you'll need Node to use the command line interface and NPM, which comes with Node. and you can go to nodejs.org/en to install it. You can install either version. I usually just install the current. It doesn't really matter. And then we're going to use the CLI, the Vue CLI, to create our Vue project. And if you go to cli.vuejs.org, you can learn more about it. That's pretty much all you need to know. And we're going to install it in our terminal of choice, exactly like this. So you'll see we're going to use the npm. You're going to have Node installed at this point. -G. That means we're installing the Vue CLI globally on our desktop, which means that we're only gonna have to do this one single time, because now it's gonna recognize this command anywhere, regardless of whatever file structure we're in. So if we're in Vue projects only, it's gonna recognize it. If we're in documents only, or somewhere else on the C drive, or in Vue.js random quote, it's installed globally. Now we have access to it, and we're gonna install @vue/CLI, and depending on how fast your computer is, this may take just a second, but it shouldn't take too long. All right, now that that's been ahead and been installed, excuse me, we're gonna go to wherever you're gonna create your project, and we're gonna just launch the terminal there. So you'll see I have a Vue projects folder, very original name, I know, and we are going to create a new project. The way that we just create a standard Vue project is npm create and then the project name. In this example, I'm gonna say quote-YouTube. That's what it is for me, and oh, I meant Vue create, excuse me, I typed npm create. So this is going to be Vue create because we're using the Vue CLI. And it's going to ask for some stuff. I'm going to skip over it. We don't really need to worry about any of this sort of stuff. This might take just a minute as well. All right, so if everything went ahead and worked, we're going to go ahead and open up our text editor of choice. I'll be using Visual Studio Code. This is my go-to text editor nowadays. And we're going to go ahead and open that folder. So documents, Vue projects, quote-YouTube. And we're going to go over a few parts of what's actually included in our Vue project. So we have our node modules, which are just the dependencies that got installed. We have a README to talk about it here. And if you ever forget, like, hey, what are the commands to do things again? These READMEs usually have something in here. So like to run your development server is npm run serve. We'll be using that in a little bit. Our dependencies, so package.json, this is all our dependencies in here. We don't really need to worry too much about that. And then let's go into this source folder. So that's where the bulk of our application is going to be. So this is our sort of main bootstrap folder. That's why it's called main.js. And what's happening here is this production tip. This is just some hints that basically give you stuff when you're working on localhost. Not to include in production, but show on local. So don't worry too much about that. But you'll see here that we are importing Vue from the Vue library, as well as our app component from app.vue. And then we're instantiating a new Vue in which we're saying, hey, go and render this to wherever we have this hashtag app ID. So, or mount it to that. And what that basically means is that if we go into our, let's say it's our public, we go here. Oh, nope, excuse me. I am looking for, so app Vue, you'll see here, our app Vue, remember that this is our app component. Our app Vue has this app ID, and all we're saying is, hey, render, mount the app component to wherever our app ID is here, and sort of load it, really, at the end of the day. And then you'll notice that the template, as I mentioned earlier, we have, Vue has their CSS files, their Vue files, and their HTML by default all in one file. So template, in between template tags is where we put our HTML. You'll notice that we already have a hello world component that we've imported in our script tag here from our components folder, and then we're passing a prop. And we'll showcase how to pass our own props in a second. I'm just trying to give a quick rundown. So if I'm going fast, don't worry about it. We're going to go into greater detail in just a minute. So you'll see we have this message prop we're passing to it. And then we're importing this because we need access to it. But here's our HTML on the template. Our JavaScript is going to be going within the script tags. That's why we're importing hello world. And then we have this export default. This is how we set up our component. This is our app component. We've named it. And then we're actually giving this components here. We have to actually instantiate that it's not just enough to import the component, we also have to say, look, our app component has access to the hello world component as well. So that's what's going on here. And then, of course, we have a style tag, which we're putting our CSS into. All right, so we're in our hello world view component. You'll see that we have some string interpolation here with the double curly braces and just a bunch of other stuff that we really don't need at this time. You also notice this scoped aspect on our style tag here. This means that this is going to essentially dynamically style the CSS to this component only. You know, these styles aren't going to carry over in a cascading fashion. All right, so now that we've just sort of gone through real briefly in assets, you'll see we just, in our case here, have the logo, the default stuff that's passed in. Now that we've gone through these files, let's go ahead and start by really cleaning up a few things. One, we don't want this hello world view component. We'll start fresh. And then in app view, we don't really want the logo, and we don't really want this as well. So we're just going to start deleting some stuff. We're going to remove the components from hello world. And what we should get when we go ahead and launch our application, and you can run your Vue local server with npm run serve, and it's going to launch a development version in just a second here. If you go to localhost, it looks like it didn't pull it up for me, so maybe it doesn't pull it. But if you go localhost 8080, you'll see that we're on our quote YouTube page, because by default the title is the same. And so what we're going to do is, I think we're just going to pull this like this and have them side by side so that we can see what we're doing when we're doing it. All right, so let's go ahead and just make some adjustments here real quick. Excellent. So the first thing that we're going to do is, what do I want to do? Let's go ahead and define our quote card component. That's going to be the card that holds everything. And I actually don't think we're going to have the string there. I don't think we're going to have anything show for a bit. So in our components, now we're going to talk, I guess, a little bit about architecture. And I'm going to, sometimes the server, when you're adding new files, it gets kind of wonky. So I'm just going to go ahead and close that till we're done creating our new files here. The way that I like to do the architecture is very similar to the Angular way, in which your components have their own folders, which then contain all the necessary parts. The reason for this is I break my stuff out into individual parts. We won't start by doing that, but we'll end by doing that. So we'll have our quote-card component in our components folder, and in here we're going to have a quote-card.component. This is a file naming convention from Angular as well, where you instantiate in the route what it is so that you can see it directly. So in this case, you have like services directives. Here we're doing components. So what we want to do is we want to have our template, which is where our HTML is going to go. We also want to have our script section, which will be where our Vue code and our JavaScript will go. And then we want to have our style section. And that by default put less on there, but we'll leave that alone. So now that we have that, we have to set up a few things in our script section just so that we can export it properly. So we're going to use the export default. Now this is just some ES6 stuff where we're essentially saying, hey, export this class, export this function. And when we put default after it, this will actually instead allow us, when we import it, to name it whatever we want. So speaking of naming, every Vue component has a name that we need to call. Remember how we injected hello world? We're going to do the same thing here with our name selector. And from what I can tell, that it goes with capitalization, not Pascal, not Camel. I forget the technical name for the capitalization case like this, but that's how we go. So this is the name of our component. Now, we might also in here have things like nested components, data. Let's go ahead and give an example of data, right? So when you're dealing with nested components, you're going to do your data like this. Nested component meaning it's not in your app component. And so what you'll see is we'll have data return like so. So this seems a little strange setup, but what we're doing here is this is going to be all the sort of local data, our model for this component that we're going to keep track of. So let's say we have a new quote text, right? Where we're going to do something like new quote. And what we want to do is when we jump into our HTML here, we're going to do some string interpolation where we're going to do new quote like so. The template root requires an element rather than text. The template root requires an element other than text. What are you talking about, Willis? Okay, so here's some ESLint stuff. So essentially, because a template is nothing more than like a virtual container, it doesn't like that we are not having this be nested within a real HTML element. So let's go ahead and start our server again and then see what's happening here. Now, by default, you'll see that nothing is displaying, and you might be wondering why. Well, we have to go into our app view settings, and we have to import that component, right? So remember how we imported hello world? We're going to import, and I typically call it something like quote card. Now that's what we're naming by default because that's what our selector is, quote dash card. So all right, cool. And we want to import it from where? From our components slash quote dash card slash quote dash card dot component dot view. All right, now that we've done that, to say, hey, this component, our app component, has access to it. We have to this other component. We have to go ahead and add it like so. So now that we've done that, great. But we're not using it anywhere. It has access to it. So let's go ahead and just instantiate our quote dash card component. And looks like we might be getting an error or so. The relative module was not found. Components quote dash card. Oh, that's because I didn't name this properly. Here we go. There we go. Let's try this one more time. There we go. And then there's our new quote. So you'll see that we're handling the string interpolation just fine. We have our new quote component as well, nested within our div app ID, and then we have our div here with the new quote. All right, so that's an example of how we might go ahead and create some data here. We're gonna dive a little bit deeper in that as well. Let's just knock out some. So let me show you real quick how we might break this out, right? So we would do our CSS in here like any other CSS, but I really am more of a fan of a larger separation of concerns, I guess. And so I'm going to define a quote.card.component.html. And in here, we're just going to go ahead and put our HTML like so. And all we have to do here, this can go on one line now, is go ahead and assign a source to our template here. It's just going to be dot slash, and this is going to be quote dash card dot component dot html. And then in the style text, we'll do the same thing here, where we're going to have a style tag, and the source here will be for a file we're about to create, which will be dot slash quote dash card dot component dot css. Let's go ahead and create that real quick. Excellent. So you'll notice that now everything is still working. Refresh the page. Everything's there. We've just separated our section out so that we can only in our view file, for the most part, focus on our JavaScript, focus on our logic aspects. And if we want to make style changes, we'll do it in the CSS file. If we want to make template changes, we'll do it in the HTML. Excellent. So let's just go ahead and build. I'm just going to rush through a little bit of HTML here, and we will start queuing things up here. So our quote card is going to be that container that's going to have everything in it. And it's going to contain our quote. It's also going to have some icons and things like that. So the way that I did my stylings was I did a ID on this, and so we're going to have a div that has a quote card in it. We're also going to have a div that has a quote in it. And then within our quote, we are going to have a, let's see here. Yeah, within the quote, we're going to have a block quote. A block quote is just a reserved HTML word. And then I'm going to need a span here to do some styles. And we'll come back to this, but essentially we'll have a quote icon that goes here. And then we will have some text as well, and then outside the span we'll have a citation which will say who the quote author is. Excellent. Alright, so I think the next step that we can do is we can go and define that quote icon class, which is really just going to be using font awesome icons. Alright, so let's go ahead and install that using npm install, and it's going to be, the name is going to be @fortawesome/fontawesome/free. That makes it a little easier to see there. So go ahead and install that. While that's installing, what we're going to do is we're going to jump into app view, and in our style tag, we're just going to use an import statement for our application. So you'll see we have our style, and what we want to do is import those. And where are we importing them from? Well, it's all relative depending on where your app is, but it should look something like this: node module /@fort awesome/font awesome-free /css/all.css, and that will add the font awesome styles we want. And while we're at it, I'm going to go ahead and remove this other stuff because that's not part of our styles, and you know, we'll remove this as well. Cool. So excellent. So we've now set up the dependency for our application. Let's jump back over to our components, and let's just make a simple nested quote icon where we're going to do some property binding in here. And so we'll just call this quote-icon. And quote icon is going to have 3 files like our other application, so our other quote. So we have quote-icon.component.html. We'll have a new file here, quote-icon.component.css, and then we'll have a quote-icon.component.view. All right, so we already talked about how to set up our template. We already talked about how to set up our styles, and then we also are going to set up our view component as well. So that's our script tag. So our template, our source is going to be /icon.component.html. Our source here is going to be /quote-icon.component.css. Excellent. And then let's go ahead and just clean this up just a little bit. Cool. All right. Now we have to again do exactly what we did before. Export default. We're gonna name it. And in my example here, just use quote icon. And then in data, again, we're gonna return. Oops. No quote here. Return an object to handle it. So actually there's no data for this, so we can get rid of that, but we are going to deal with props. So what we want to do is we want to A prop is a value that we're passing into another component. So where we're going to use this is first we are going to jump into here in our quote icon card component. But what we're going to need to do is, because this is a dependency, we need to add the quote icon to our quote card class so that we can use it. So we're going to have to import quote icon from dot slash, it'll be quote dash icons slash quote dash icon dot component dot view. And if you remember earlier, we showcased how to do this just doing components. Like so. Cool. So there's our components. Gonna save that. All right, so now it has access to it, which means that when we jump into our quote card, just gonna close some of this quote card, we can now go ahead and inject it like we want it to. So, so we have our quote dash icon. That's our quote icon class. And what we want to do is we want to do property binding. So I'm going to define something called class name, not to be confused with class name from React. This is just a naming coincidence on my end. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the quote that we want for that, which is going to be the fos-fa- or the class that we want to dynamically set, the fos-fa-quote-left. And so this is a property that we are passing in, or a prop. And we need to go into our quote icon component and just make sure that it's capable of handling that properly. And so the way that we can do that is using the props keyword. And props takes an array of values, and all we have to do here is define those strings that we're taking in, which is class name. So, we don't want to just take in any value. We want to make sure that it is accurate. So we take in props. So now, if we go into our quote icon.html, let's just go ahead and see if we can output class name when we save it. And I think I might have to relaunch our server. Excellent. There we go. Refresh this. Oh, I had this error before where the fave icon was giving me an issue. Let's see. Debug time. All right, I had the same issue where I forgot to put a div in here, but you'll see here that we're actually able to pass that text in to our component area like so. So now that we've made that association, meaning we have access to we're passing data from our quote card template to our quote icon component as a prop, we can do stuff with that data, right? So in our example, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and just do some property binding, which means that instead of this, we're going to use the I tag. And if you want to dynamically set attributes or properties of a class, you can do so with the colon and then the value that's already there. So in this case, we want to pass in the class name like so. And what we should get is just an icon. So now we have our quote icon using dynamic property binding for our quote icon class. And we can do this for any icons that we need now at this point in time. And I think for the quote icon class, the only thing that I added, this isn't about CSS, but we're just going to add some margin dash left of 5 pixels on here. And I believe we will be done with our quote icon at this point. So we talked about property binding. We built our quote icon. And let's go ahead and expand a little bit on our quote card HTML. And so what we're going to have is a quote author and a quote. We haven't really set up any function calls. So what we want to do is let's go ahead and create some methods in our quote card component at this time. So if you want to have a method, you just use a methods, which, as you might imagine, and you're going to have it nested within. So in our methods, like so, we're going to create a function called getQuote, and this is going to be an async function. If you're not familiar with async and await, essentially what it's going to allow us to do is it's going to, and this isn't Vue, this is just current JavaScript, it's going to give us the ability to handle promises in a synchronous fashion. And what we want are, what we're going to do here is get a response. And you know what, this is actually a good time to introduce the Vue resource library, which is how to handle HTTP within Vue. And so let's jump into app Vue, and we're going to close our server real quick, and we're going to add a dependency real quick as well, which is Vue resource. So Vue resource is the HTTP package, so we're going to npm install Vue-resource. This will take just a second, but while that's installing, let's jump into our app component, and we're going to need to instantiate the dependency. We're going to need to tell the application, you know what, we give you full permission to use it in our, where did we do that? Did we do that in quote card? Let's see here. No, it's not actually on the app level, but on the main level. So here we have to go ahead and import Vue resource from Vue-resource. And so that's not enough, right? What we need to do now as well is we are going to take Vue, which we imported. And if you ever worked with like Express, it's going to feel very similar. Vue is really feels very similar to Express and to Angular 1. If you haven't kind of got that feeling with Angular 1, which was a great inspiration of it. So Vue resource. Now we have access to it. Now our entire Vue application has access to it we set it up in our main file. So now in our quote card component, where we're defining this method, what we're going to do here is we're going to create a const, and we'll go ahead and just call this response, and we're going to await. We'll say, hey, handle this synchronous thing, and just wait here until it's done. This dot use the $HTTP to use the Vue resource application. What is it we're trying to do? Well, we're trying to get some data from a location, and the API that we'll be using is this one. Cool, which is Tolik's API /quote/random. So that's going to give us our response. Then we're going to want to convert it to JSON, which is also an asynchronous item. So we're going to await that as well. All we're going to do is response.json. Oops, no equals. Where did that come from? Excellent. So we're going to turn it into JSON. And at this point, we have our data, but let's go ahead and take a little bit of an object-oriented approach to this, and we'll just create a new quote model. This is what I did. This isn't really anything to do with Vue, but you know, we'll create a models folder, and in models we'll go ahead and create a quote.model.js file, and in here we're just going to export a class called quote. And all quote's really going to do is have a constructor, and that's going to take in some data, and no quotes, no parentheses on there. And what we're going to say is this dot quote is equal to data dot quote, and then this dot data, or this dot author, is equal to data dot author. And just so that we're all on the same page about what we're actually going to be getting from this API call, let's go ahead and just bring up a page real quick so that we can see. And you'll see that we get a quote, an author, and a category. We're not doing anything with the category, so I just did quote and an author. But this is going to be different every time. It's a random quote API that we'll be using. So that's where those properties came from. Let's jump back into the code. So now that we have that, what we want to do is on our data model here, we're going to want to store that, right? Because we want to display it. So we can, within our data here, create a quote property. That makes sense. And in here, we can say new quote if we want. But we haven't really passed. There's really no need to do that. We can also go ahead and just do quote. Or excuse me, what do we call it? Yeah, it was quote. And we'll just set it to empty string, and then author, and we'll set it to empty string as well. There's better ways of doing this, but I think this is fine. And then in here, we want to say this dot quote is equal to a new quote of the JSON data that we just got back. And every time we click get quote, this will go ahead and this needs to be quote. But every time we do this now, we'll go ahead and get we'll get a new quote in the form that we want, and we'll omit the category. We don't need that, right? So all we have to do next is sort of sync up this get quote call so that we have access to it. But first thing that we can do is go ahead and do some string interpolation on our quote card component. And so we have our quote icon. The quote is going to be following shortly after, so that's just going to be quote.quote. And then we're going to have, remember our citation, we said we're going to put our author there. So then we're going to have a quote dash author like so. And I don't think I actually imported our quote file yet. So in our script tag, what we need to do is we can import quote from our models file so we can actually use it. Excellent. And so at this point, we have set it up. We haven't really tested it yet, but we will. And we'll do that by creating a button in the HTML where we can get the new quote. But you know, we're probably thinking like, hey, I want a new quote to load without having to click it on the first time. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use a lifecycle method to make that happen. Now there's a bunch of different lifecycle methods in pretty much any framework you're going to work with. But the one that I'm going to focus on, or that I'm going to use, is called created, which means the component's been built, and now we want to go ahead and have it do something. Oops, excuse me. And what we're going to do here is we're going to define created as a async function. Actually, I don't think it needs to be asynchronous. But we'll have a function here. I used async in my example. I don't know why, or in my original thing. I think that's a bug. So this dot quote. Get quote, excuse me. This dot get quote. So now, let me go ahead and relaunch my server real quick. And now when we do this, what we should get is a updated quote that's being displayed in our application here in just 1 second. Assuming everything was set up properly. Big assumption. Failed to decode param. What did I break again? Oh, we have a little bit of an issue here. Like so. That should fix that. Misspelled that. But now, oops. So we got something, and then we got not a number. Author is not defined on the instance, but referenced during render. So it looks like we might have a little bit of an issue here. Author. And then quote model, this dot author, data dot author, and then in here, quote dash author. There we go. Simple typo here. But you'll see that every time we refresh the page now, it's going and getting a new quote, and it's defined in a function, so we can now do this on click just fine. And this is happening because we used the created lifecycle to handle all that. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and just expand on the HTML a little bit. So we're going to close up some files. So outside of our block quote, I defined a div called quote-actions. And then I have a span here called span with an ID and this was actually an ID as well. ID called a quote dash icons. And then I have another span, which we'll get to in just a second. And then I have a another span and another span. And then finally, outside of the quote icon span, here I have a button. And we're going to give this an ID equal to quote dash button. And in here, we have our new quote text. Remember, we defined that earlier in our quote card component view here, where it's just, hey, new quote. We should get quote. I don't know. So how do we set this up to trigger? Well, we can use, anytime you want to use a event, you can use the v-on colon, then that event name, which is click, and then set it equal to the item. So basically all the events, click, double click, hover, focus, all this sort of stuff. There's something like this, and they all are prefixed by v-on colon. And what we want to do here is call get quote. Now you could put just this in, that would work. You can also put this in, that would work as well. So let's go ahead and get out of here for a second. So we have this new quote, and you'll see that it's now dynamically getting it, because when we click get quote, it's updating these model values that we are putting out, and so we're getting a new quote that is getting updated on click from the API. So that's how we're going to do that. Now let's go ahead and talk about how to do multiple iterations in our application. So we have this span that I gave quote icons, and in our span here, sometimes we get arrays of values back, and maybe we have some icons that we want to put out, like remember we had the Twitter icon that was going to do something, and then the YouTube icon. So let's go into our data property and create an array of icons. And in here, we're just going to have an object, and I'm going to give it just a value of class name. And what's our class name? These are going to be icons, right? So we're going to pass in the class name for it. It makes sense to define it. We don't have to call it this way. But we're going to call this fab-twitter-square Twitter-square fa-2x. Excellent. And then we're going to go ahead and pass in a class name here for YouTube. Now, I don't really have, so our code's going to look a little wonky here, because I suppose we could expand upon this. I didn't. We'll come back to this in a second. I know I'm talking in circles, but it'll all make sense soon. So let's jump back into here. And so we're in quote icons. So now that we've defined that array, how do we iterate through it? Well, we can just use a v-for directive. And we're going to say icon in icons, or item in icons. Icons being the array. Icon being the item in the array. We want to do some stuff. So we already talked about how to do dynamic property binding in our href here. So if we wanted to pass a string directly, in our case, we want to concat the quote text with it for our Twitter aspect. So the way that we do that, so that it brings up the tweet, is we prefix it with this. This will give us our text, and then we just have to add our quote dot quote to it, and then we want to add the property here of target is equal to blank. So that opens it up in a new window. And what are we passing in here? Well, we want to go ahead and pass a quote dash icon, a quote dash icon. And remember, we are passing the in this case, we're going to be dynamically passing the class name property because it's not a string. And so we're going to use the colon here, and it's just going to be the icon.className. Excellent. So at this point, what we should see are two quotes that are being outputted, a Twitter and a YouTube. And the kind of what I was talking about, so the way I set this up is that even the YouTube's going to do the tweet thing. We could do some more complicated logic later on to fix that. I was really just trying to show an example for the V4. But let's not worry too much about that. So excellent. So we have our icons set up using quote icon. And then we have, oh, I created one too many spans. And then oh no, I didn't. So let's talk about VIF and VL. So you may not want to always display, you know, something on the page, only in certain circumstances. So let's go ahead and say last author here. Save this. Excellent. And we want to say, look, who was the last author? But there may not be a last author if it's the first load. So we're going to say VIF last author. And we're going to jump into our component here, and we're going to say last author, and we can go ahead and just set it to an empty string. So empty strings, if you're not familiar with sort of the falsy values in JavaScript, are a falsy value, which means it's going to evaluate to false. So we're going to have last author, and we're just going to set it to an empty string. So that's why that's not going to show up. And so when we jump into our quote card component like so, we're going to have a last author colon last author. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and jump back into our component here. And we're just going to say this dot last author is equal to what I do? Is equal to this dot quote dot author. So here we are updating the last author, saying, hey, who was the last quote author? And the quote author by default is empty string, so nothing's going to change for the first load. But you'll notice that we don't get our last author text on here. But when we do new quote, why isn't it working? What did I do? Oh, maybe I didn't save. I was like, that should work. All right, there you go. But you'll see we now get last author when there was a last author. And so we can also have a VElse to handle the other situation as well. So VElse will be the opposite value. So let's say we want to say we want to use VElse. Now I'm not sure what happens when there's multiple VElses and things like that. I haven't got that deep into it quite yet, or had that happen. But we're gonna throw VElse here, and we can put maybe something like no last author. So when VIF here evaluates to false, then it's gonna show whatever's in VElse. So you'll see we have no last author. Now we have a last author, so it goes away. So you can use VElse alongside it. So we've covered quite a bit. I want to just do some quick CSS to get us up and going here so that we have something that looks like a respectable application. And then we're going to dive into the router, which I believe is the last thing I wanted to cover. So let's start, we'll start in app view. So in app view, let's just go in here. We are going to just give it some color, a body, and we're going to say background dash color of maroon. You don't have to use maroon, you can do whatever you want, but let's start there. And then we're going to quote icon, we're already good on the margin left, and then quote card component is where the rest of our CSS is going to go. So in our quote card component.css, I actually imported a font, the Roboto font. So you can get it from that URL, and we're just adding that Google font. And then we're going to say, look, we want everything, that's what the asterisk here, to use the font dash family of Roboto. No need for the quotes because it's single. And then on our icons, we want all of our icons to have a pointer on it as well. meaning that we're gonna have a click hand, and we were gonna want to make the icons a maroon color as well, because the card itself will be white, if you remember. And we gave a quote dash card ID, and now we're going to do some CSS grid. If you're not familiar with CSS grid, I have a video on my channel breaking it down, but we're going to make it a grid. We're then going to have 5 columns in our grid, so we're going to say grid dash template dash columns, and we're going to repeat that 5 times and make it 1 fraction or 1/5 an area. And then we're actually going to have a grid dash template areas as well, just to define it. So this is going to be a little bit of our margin. Then we're going to say quote, 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 margin. And we want the text color here to be maroon as well. Now in our quote, within our quote ID, we're going to say this, our grid area here is in fact quote. That's where the reference to it is. We're going to change that background color of the card to white. We're going to curve the corners a little bit with border radius, put 5 pixels, and then we're going to give it a little bit of padding of 20 px like so. I know I'm blowing through it, so I apologize if you're not like a CSS god or anything like that, but this is a CSS tutorial, so I'm trying to just make it look a little bit nice. We're also going to have another grid nested within here that's going to handle a few things, and we're just going to make this grid dash template columns. Throat got really dry real quick. So 1FR, and then we're going to give it a margin of 5 pixels. So that's our block quote, and then remember we had our citation for it, and what we're going to do here is have that float, not float, but justify itself to the end of our grid. And then our block quote icons, we want to actually give it a little bit more margin, so we're going to say margin dash right 10 px, and then we're going to style that button a little bit, and we're going to give it no border. We're going to give it a border dash radius of 2 pixels. We're going to say the background dash color is white. We're also going to say the wait, what? I have 2 background colors. One is white, one is maroon. I think I probably meant maroon because that's what's going to override it. And then I am going to say the color of the text is white. And then we're going to give it a padding of 0.25 EM and 0.5 EM, and that's going to go for, you know, the whole thing because it's going to translate. And we want that cursor to be a pointer as well because it's a button. And finally, we're almost there, guys. And then we have a hashtag quote dash icons, and in here we're going to say the grid dash area is icons, and then the hashtag quote dash button is a new, I might have meant to, I don't even know if we need this. We might be removing this because I think I meant to do another grid, but I didn't. I just called it quits. And then the margin, the hashtag last dash author, and this is going to be a margin dash left of 5px. Did I miss anything? It looks like I did because I have 59 versus my 67. Real quick check. So we have import URL. We have this. We have our icons, quote card. We have quote, block quote. We have site. We have block quote I. We have button. Here we go. So we missed the quote action. So I did have another grid. I was like hashtag quote dash actions, and this will be a grid, and then the column 1FR, and then grid dash template dash areas, and that's going to take up icons, new dash quote. All right. So if everything's set up, we should have our nice little CSS stuff. Nothing's really changed. We have a new quote here. That text is quite a bit wrapping. There we go. We're zoomed in about 200% for the video, but 100%. Just a new quote. Danger is cool. So nice. So the last thing that I want to talk about now that we have this built is I want to go ahead and showcase how to use routing, right? So right now we don't have any additional routes. We're gonna have to install another dependency that's the Vue router library. So let's bring our item down here. Control C. We're gonna npm install Vue-router. This will take just a second. In the meantime, let's jump into our main.js file, and we're gonna import it. So import Vue router from Vue router, and much like Vue resource, we're gonna have to use it. Vue.use Vue router. Excellent. And now we're gonna have to configure our router. So there's a little bit more setup here. So we're gonna say const router is equal to a new Vue router. And we're going to put mode for history, which seems to be the default value. And then this base here as well, say, hey, where do we, where is this router starting? It's starting on the base level, the root level. And now we're going to find some routes. So routes take in two things. They take it, routes is an array of objects, and they take in two properties. The path to the route. So in our thing, we'll say it's quote, and then the component you want it to load on that route, which will be quote card. Now that we've done that, what we need to do is, that's pretty much all the setup minus one last thing, or two last things. We need to pass in router to our new view, our object, and then we have to go into our app view and we have to define where we want our router to be injected in our application. So where is my app view? So the way that we do that is, instead of having this quote card dynamically injected, we will go ahead and inject our router-view, and all our views will be here. And we can go ahead and create a button real quick. This is actually, that's fine. Let's see here. So now you'll see when we refresh our page. Oh, well, we have to restart our development server. But what we'll see is that on the home page, that view is no longer there. However, if we wanted to, let's just say we did something like this, and we put like an H1 here, and we put random Vue.JS, random quote generator, random quote. What we should get, quote card is not defined. What is the issue? All right, so let's go fix our code real quick. So I think I forgot to import quote card. No, it's here. So, oh, we didn't import it here. So cool, save that. I think that should solve our issue now. And so you'll see we get Vue.js random quote, and there's nothing on the home page, right? Because we didn't set up that route. But if we were to go to something like /quote, did I set something up wrong? I don't think so. Oh, /quote, there we go. Dun, dun, dun. There we go. And we have everything set up. While we're at it, let's go ahead and just style that H1 with a little bit of style. So in our app view, we can just do H1 color white, text dash align center. And there we go. So we've talked about how to create an application in Vue. We've talked about how to do dynamic property bindings, lifecycle methods, routing, HTTP, props, ng-for, ng-if, ng-else, how to do event bindings with like v-on. So we've covered quite a bit, and hopefully you have a nice little project to get you going here. Connect to APIs. This was a lot of fun. I sort of built this over about 2 hours just playing around with Vue for the first time. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to drop a like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and check out my courses in the description below. I think I'll be spending more and more time with Vue, and I might build a course, like a 5-project course or something like that down the road. I appreciate it, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye. So today's question comes from the Facebook group Code Tech Caffeine, which I've created. If you're interested, there's a link in the description. But Greg Fine says, is it still valuable to be proficient at creating layouts using floats, or does Flexbox/CSS Grid eliminate the need? I think in general, when you have sort of newer technologies, it's good to understand the baseline ones that came before it, such as floats in this example. But typically, learning the latest is usually the better option because they were created to fill an issue, right? If floats were doing an awesome job with layouts, CSS Grid and Flexbox never would have came about. And those are the technologies you want to work on because they'll help deliver a greater product down the road. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. Hope you subscribed and hit that notification bell. Check out my latest course, the 100 Algorithms Challenge, where we go through 100 different algorithms in JavaScript and TypeScript so that you can ace your next JavaScript coding interview. You can get it in the description for just $9.99. Check it out. See you next time. Thanks for watching.